All right. Good morning, everyone.
Oh yeah, last time we switched it back. It's fine.
So I think we ought to start today with,
Bill's not used to be being to the left of him.
the mic is on, yes. We're going to start today with some, the planning department has devised some graphic illustrations of what we're looking at. And I think it might be helpful to take a look at those.
And you also asked for a heat map, which they did as well.
Okay, great. So let's start by taking a look at some of that graphic representation.
So the first thing we wanted to do was give you some examples because we know that one of the big topics is about detached accessory dwelling units. So we wanted to give you some examples of accessory structures. We do not know for certain if these are official accessory dwelling units. They are in Kentlands. Kentlands does have the ability to do these kinds of accessory structures. And there are quite a few of them. These are, those are some examples, and
Previous.
I am going to previous. Again, I think the key thing, and we did go around and look at some accessory units or accessory structures elsewhere in the county. There actually are quite a lot of them, whether they're being used as accessory dwelling units or simply as studios or small home offices. They are not unusual in the county. Although what we also did discover, again, this is our existing ADU counts, 473. And what we did discover is that we separated it out by zone, and we highlighted the R200, R60, and R90 zones because in those zones, only attached accessory units are allowed, those that are within the body of the house.
Interior is a...
Correct, interior. And actually, the majority of our existing ADUs are in those three zones, 390 in total, and that's 83% of the existing ADUs. And I think what that goes to show is, although we're talking a lot about the issue of detached versus the internal ones, we believe that this is a minimum of the number that are internal. We did not go through all of the other zones and go out and visit them or check, but I think probably many of those are also internal, that there is a real minority of ADUs that are in detached structures. It is the exception rather than the rule.
Well, and how would you even have one in an R60 or an R90 today? You'd have to have either an acre or perhaps
Right.
it would be grandfathered under some...
No, I think it would be hard to do, and the reality, again, I think, is that even in the other zones, we think most of them are internal. There are still a few, I'm sure, that are detached, but it is the exception rather than the rule. This is in the county, the existing R60, R90, R200 zones. And it's the darkest color is R90, the yellow is R60, and the light yellow is R200. So it shows you where those zones exist in the county. We also mapped all of the existing ADUs.
Okay, I just want to pause on this one because I think this is important. We've heard some say, only allow them within a certain proximity of, for example, transit stops like Metro or something like that. This map shows that we essentially have them where we have housing. I mean, that's pretty much follows population density, don't you think?
Yeah, and there's a heat map next, which I think sort of shows the same kind of thing, which is, yes, they seem to be, heavily concentrated.
With the exception of Rockville, is that we don't have data there, or they're not allowed?
I don't know.
The city of Rockville has its own zoning and program.
Yeah, I think we didn't look at it because we don't have access to their
So
zoning
We should
information.
not assume that there aren't
Right.
ADUs in Rockville and Gaithersburg.
The same way.
For some reason, somebody filed a license with the county in Gaithersburg, but generally,
They have
Those
their
are
own planning.
city
and zoning.
licensed.
We don't monitor or keep track of.
saying that they should not be allowed where we have housing generally would really, it would just cut against the opportunity to live in this county for so many people.
Yes, and there are many reasons that people do ADUs. Some of them, again, as we discussed at the last work session, some of them are to supplement income so that folks can afford to live in their house. Some of them are for family members. You know, some of them have nothing to do with people who are necessarily commuting. It may be for, you know, an elderly parent or for a disabled child. And, you know, those could be anywhere in the county. It has nothing to do with, you know, proximity to transit.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the other issue I think that bears thinking about is that if you were to say you can only get an ADU license in places that were close to transit, if you had an accessory structure which you built for a family member, which you can already use today without the necessity of getting the ADU license, at some point, if that
Right.
structure is no longer useful to your family member, you want to sell it, it would interfere with your ability to sell the property.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it would just be it would be a massive restriction of where it's allowed, and it would, like, why is it okay to live in Olney, but not to have an accessory, you know, not to be able to live in Olney in an accessory structure? It just, we want people to be able to live in Olney. We like Olney. It's a great place to live. Why would it be wrong to say you can't live there in an accessory structure? I just don't get it. But, okay.
So continuing on, in the R60 zone, we did some information about what R60 lot size would allow. And although a property is R60 and the lot is intended to be a minimum of 6,000 square feet, they actually vary in size. And there are about 18% that are actually even less than 6,000 square feet in size. They're probably older, grandfathered kinds of lots. But if you take the whole average of all of the lots in R60, they actually are about, on average, 8,000 square feet. So there are some that are less than 6,000, but there are quite a few that are more than 6,000, and it averages out that R60 ends up being about 8,000 square feet. In the R60 zone, if you were going to do new construction on an R60 lot and you had 35% lot coverage, this is the kind of house that you could build. This would be, by right. You'd certainly have to meet all building codes and stormwater requirements and so forth for new construction, but this is the size house that you could build. And as you can see, it fills up the lot pretty significantly. This, again, just shows it in plan. If you had an existing house that was, about 1,500 square feet in footprint and you wanted to add on to it, you could add on to it. And this would be an existing house with an addition. Again, this, I can tell you from my old life in historic preservation, this happens, and I'm sure Diana has this experience with building permits. This happens constantly. People are always adding on for a larger kitchen and family room and a master bedroom above. That's the tradition, and we see those kinds of additions all the time. And they do, at times, maximize the 35% lot coverage. Again, this is looking at it in plan. This is if you were to keep your existing single-family house and add a 600 square foot, two-story accessory dwelling unit. This is the maximum that you could do. And think of it almost as essentially a three-car garage with a level above it.
The reason it's the maximum is because of the lot coverage.
Right.
It's also a maximum because of the 1,200 square foot. It's 2 stories on 600 square feet.
Oh, okay.
But I think it actually also pretty well maxes out the lot coverage as well. But, and then this is the same idea in plan.
No, this is under
under
the,
the
pro-
proposal.
well, this
'cause that
is,
threw me off when he said that 1,200.
we have not yet as a committee agreed that 1,200 feet is the cap, but I think that's what you were.
Well, I think that
Using that,
today,
But today,
It is a
it is
cap.
1,200 feet, yeah.
today it is, so
You
we're.
just can't
sort
build
of-
it on the R60, so that's it, okay.
Right, we're showing what a cap today is. This is the same footprint, but with one story. And again, I think you can think of it, if you want to try to visualize it, it would be a three-car garage. A three-car garage is about 20 feet by 60 feet. A two-car garage is about, I'm sorry,
30 feet.
yes, 30 feet, thank you. And a two-car garage is about 20 by 20, just to give you sort of a ballpark idea of what these structures are like.
It's not a lot bigger than the house with the addition. I think that's kind of
Right,
a major point here.
right. So we did this same exercise for the R90 zone. This is the buildable area. In the R90 zone, again, we have a similar situation where about 20% of the lots that are in the R90 zone are actually a bit smaller than 9,000 square feet. Again, they're older grandfathered lots, but there are many others that are bigger than 9,000 square feet. So the average size of all the lots that are zoned R90 is 12,000 square feet. So, which is a bit bigger. This shows a one-story ADU at 700 square foot footprint. This shows a two-story. In the R200 zone, there's actually a lot of, again, a lot of lots that are smaller, and there are some, about 20%, that are actually bigger than 20,000 square feet. Sometimes we do a cluster development, or there are different reasons that things end up being either a bit smaller or a bit larger. But the average size ends up being 17,000 square feet in the R200 zone. And again, here you can see the one-story with the existing house, and this would be it if you added a second story. What we wanted to emphasize with just a few examples is, you know, today, folks are maxing out their 35% lot coverage with what we call, you know, tear downs. There's been a lot of conversation about tear downs. And you can see some examples here of, you know, houses which have, again, by right, maxed out their lot coverage. I'm not going to go back to those. But the bottom line is that, you know, adding an addition or even adding a detached accessory dwelling unit would probably have the same or frankly less impact than a tear down. And again, I just want to re-emphasize that we think these detached units are going to be the exception and not the rule. I do not think we're going to see many, many of them. I mean, again, think of it in terms of, you know, a 2 or 3 car garage with a second floor above it. That's what the size of a detached accessory dwelling unit probably would be.
Terrific.
The only thing I would say on a tear down might be subject to the infill development rules, which would limit it to 30%, not 35%. So if you completely demolish the building, you have a lower lot coverage that you can build.
So it depends on whether you completely demolish or have a huge expansion.
Well, again, as if the expansion is above 50% of the pre-existing one, then it would trigger the infill development and have the lower percentage as well. So it would always have to be 50% or less, and that is what an ADU is as well, is 50% or yes. So an ADU does not trigger the infill requirements as we have it right now.
I mean, to me, the takeaway is you shouldn't have a permissive set of rules for people building really expensive houses and a very strict set of rules for people who want to build more moderate-priced houses. That just seems, like the opposite of what we would want to promote in this county. And yet that's what a lot of people seem to be asking us for. They don't quite realize that you can do this with your house. You can expand your house to this limit. And, it happens all the time. You're seeing a lot of houses, and in fact, a lot of communities, accessory dwelling units are considered an anti-displacement strategy, a way to push back against mansionization, because it gives people a way to continue to live in their house, to get a little bit more value out of their house without having to sell it. It just changes the dynamics a little bit. And so if we don't allow detached units, as we don't now, we are essentially saying that in the R60, you can build a big mansion, but you can't build a 600-foot detached cottage. That just doesn't seem consistent with our values, I gotta say. Okay, let's go to the packet.
All right, going to the packet, and we'll start with actually on page 3. Since we went through some of the material that I already had, including the information by zone. And I've restructured the issues to address what the committee wanted to address first, which is the 1,200 square feet.
Thank you.
And all of the sort of corollary measurements around that. I think Tim wants to say something.
Hi, Tim.
Good morning, Tim Getzinger, Acting Director, DHEA. I just wanted to point out on page 2, there's been some confusion on the numbers, and if we can just go with some round numbers, there's about 200 Class 1 ADUs, there's 2 more that are in process, about 150 Class 3 ADUs, there's about 40 or so that are in process, and in terms of the RLUs, they're a non-conforming zone type, so they're not really tracked electronically. There used to be a lot more in the past, and some folks are wondering, why are there less? And what happens is we go out and we check and see if the current owner is still there. If they are, it needs to be up to code. If it's been sold, then it either needs to be capped. It can no longer be an accessory dwelling unit, or they can apply for a Class 3 license. So that's the reason why there are less RLUs now. Currently, there's about 490 or so of them. We are going through all the SDAT records to check the ownership, and we expect there to be about 250 to 300 at the end of the review. We did
190 RLUs.
There are 490 RLUs right now in paper files.
Okay.
We expect that there'll be about 250 to 300 after the review is complete. We reviewed 100 RLUs to date, and we found right around 60 to 70 or so are current RLUs. So that's what the data is suggesting. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Not the thousands of RLUs that some have said.
And what that seems to be is we're just adding Class 1s, Class 2s, and the RLUs to get to that.
Migrating into the.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
And again, RLUs just meant you couldn't rent them. They were for a family member or a household member or whatever, whoever you didn't want to rent to, but somebody lived there. Okay, so we're going to go through measurements and other interesting things. One is whether the 1,200 square foot limit should be deleted. It exists now. It does in fact relate to the, if you will, the maximum minimum size.
All right.
Hard to say. 600 square feet is what you're always allowed without regard to footprint of your house. So 1,200 square feet would allow 2 stories on that. It also has something to do a million years ago that in the mid-'70s, the average house was 2,400 square feet. So 1,200 was 50% of that, if you want to go into history on that. 1,200 is used in other municipalities on the West Coast, and in fact, some of those municipalities use a smaller maximum limit. Again, part of it is to decrease the price that would be charged in rent for these things, so that they are, if you will, at least market rate affordable.
On the other hand, I talked to Portland, and they do have an allowance for 1,200. I think you may have to go through some additional steps to get it. But they say you really should have 1,200 because that makes it more likely that families will be able to occupy them for kids, so that kids could be able to go to school. You don't see that very often. It's just not something that people really take advantage of. But
Well, the bottom line to my recommendation is let's not be silly about the maximum. If you have a floor plate that is already larger than 1,200 square foot, and your basement is larger than 1,200 square foot, and your basement's going to be used for the ADU, then allow
Yes.
allow.
that's a good,
beyond
thank you,
12.
Jeff. That was a good refinement. So your recommendation here is retain the 1,200 square foot limit, but then have the additional provision that the floor plate, if the floor plate is bigger, then you can use an interior unit, it can be bigger too.
Right.
So I think that sounds fine. Is any comments on that? Okay, Andrew.
Thank you. I totally agree on the, what did you call it? The internal structure? Interior, okay. Interior floor plate. We keep changing the vernacular, so I'm trying to keep track. But the interior piece, particularly the basement, I mean, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to restrict it if require putting a wall up or anything like that if it's not having an impact on neighbors or anything to that nature. My one concern is just some level of appreciation for R60 and R90. I mean, there already are some restrictions to what the size would be because of the lot coverage restrictions that exist. And so there will be just natural restrictions already in the existing code. But, I had mentioned at the last meeting, and just in terms of looking at some of the lot size coverage of whether for detached units we have, a lot percentage size. I had suggested 10%, just to make sure that the size of the units in R60 and R90 particularly are appropriate.
There's nothing that you're doing or have suggested in the ZTA to change the total lot coverage number. What I thought you had recommended was 10% of the rear yard, or no, it was 10% of the total. I think that just adds another restriction, whereas you already have the 600 square foot, if you will, maximum size without regard to the floor plate of the building, so that's a restriction as well that will.
What's the 600? I'm sorry.
600 square foot is the maximum size without regard to the size of the footprint of your building. It's the greater of 600 square foot, or 50% of the floor plate of your building. So if, excuse me? That you can have as a detached unit. So if I have more than a 1,200 square foot floor plate building, I can have a detached ADU that's larger than 600 square
You're
feet.
saying if it's, I'm sorry, you
No, no, please.
so you're saying that it would be 1,200 feet limit unless your house is smaller than 2,400 square feet, in which case it's 50%? Is that basically what you're saying?
The only, I'm dealing with one number at a time, I'm trying. Which is the maximum is 1,200 unless your basement is bigger. Then we can get to, the maximum size of the detached unit, which right now,
You're starting with interior, okay.
starting with the interior.
So I check on that, 1,200, unless
I'm,
your interior is bigger?
on the interior, I'm fine with that. I mean,
Yes, on the interior, 1,200.
I think,
Yes.
for me, and I think we kind of really honed in on this last time, we didn't get into any conclusions, but I think there was at least significant discussion on detached presenting a different concern related to size, particularly, at least for me, in R60 and R90 zones, because some of those lots are quite small.
And they're small, and then you have some minimum setbacks from the side and the rear. And what it does is it gets close to the principal dwelling and fairly close to neighbors, and you have windows looking on windows. It's certainly easier to do these things as attached with regard to the design of the lot and something that looks, if you will, normal. I think Mark Beal from DPS has
Mark
some.
Beal, zoning plan review manager. The 50% or 600 square feet is a footprint to footprint, not necessarily a footprint to total square footage of the
right, also.
ADU. It seemed like that we were getting a little confused there, so I just wanted to make sure that it's 50% of the footprint of the main structure or 600 square feet would be the ADU footprint, not the total square footage of the ADU.
Right, so I'm
I just
saying
want to make sure that's all.
a 600 square foot footprint could be 2 stories. And
Correct.
if you could do it within 20 feet.
I think that's okay, but what if you have an 800 square foot cottage, it's a single story, that would be not allowed under that.
Then your footprint of your accessory, because has to do with accessory structures. So your accessory structure then would be 600 square feet footprint.
But I'm saying, what if you had an 800?
You're still allowed a minimum of it, whichever is greater.
Yeah, it's whichever's greater.
So you'd still be allowed the 600 square feet. And if you could do it in 20 feet of height, you could do a 2-story building.
Okay. Again, we are in agreement about 1,200 feet,
Unless the basement is bigger.
unless the basement is bigger for the interior unit.
Okay, this is good. All right, now we had.
But I still think we have to figure out detached.
Yeah, we will.
Yeah, okay, so I just want to make sure. I mean, just to clarify, because we're talking about what this could mean, and what I have proposed, and my goal is to get to making sure that we have an appropriate size detached structure in smaller lots. I am open, I just want to be clear, I'm not married to anybody, actually. I'm not married to the idea of it needing to be 10%.
In other words, he's looking.
10%. I don't know if I'm looking. My mom is certainly looking very hard on my behalf. But the 10% is just the way that I think that we could potentially get there, but I'm open to any other idea that gets us to the same, general conclusion. But just to be clear, on in an R60 lot that's 6,000 square feet, you could go to 2,100 total lot coverage currently.
That's,
Which means if you had a principal structure of 1,400 square feet, which wouldn't be abnormal, you could have a 700 square foot accessory dwelling unit. In a 6,000 square foot, what I'm saying is it would be restricted to 600 square feet, which I think is more appropriate for a 6,000 square foot lot.
May I ask, are you saying in all 6,000 foot lots, the detached structure should be limited to 600 feet?
yes.
If it's 6,000 square feet, yeah, it should be restricted to 6.
Variation, though.
And the reason why originally I was thinking about R60 and R90, but the reality was when we actually looked at the data, not all R60s and R90s are created equal, and some of them are quite different.
Is that footprint or total? square footage.
It's, you were saying 10% of the lot area is the maximum size of the
It
footprint.
would be footprint.
So it would be 600
But-
foot footprint.
One idea, I'm gonna just,
But a normal tiny house is 400 to 500 square feet. I mean, I just want to be clear, we're not saying that you can't have a tiny house, you could. I mean, this would be,
right, these are large sizes. 1,200 square feet is the size of, at least a three-bedroom apartment. It's big. There are many one-bedroom apartments that are 400 to 500 feet in size. So one idea that I want to just put out there, and it isn't related to the proportion of the lot, because I'm trying to, I think all of us are trying to, my new credo is simplify, simplify, simplify. Try to get to things that are pretty straightforward. We could say in R60 and R90, you can have a detached accessory dwelling unit no bigger than 800 square feet total, whether it's on one or two floors. And in R200 and above, it can go up to 1,200. The reason I was picking 800 square feet is, again, I think about it, again, I'm trained as an architect, so my mind is to the design. If you have a two-car garage, which almost every person would say is a reasonable thing perhaps to want to build in an R60 or an R90 lot. Most people would say, of course, you should be allowed to have a two-car garage. That's 400 square feet. If you're going to do two levels, that's 800 square feet. That would not be I think, a disproportionate sized building in almost any R60 or R90 lot. If you think that, then you should say folks aren't allowed to have two-car garages in R60 and R90, but I think they should be allowed to. So you could even build a two-car garage with a 400 square foot apartment above, and that could be a one-bedroom apartment.
and 8,000 square feet was the average size of an R60 zone based on the data that
Correct.
we have. Just to close the loop here, it doesn't mean that, not all, as I mentioned. I mean, my view was that not all are created equal, and so the 10% would slide with the different sizes, but I'm open to others'
I just,
thoughts on this, because you're getting us close to, the same goal on
Do I
that.
understand your proposal, Mr. Friedson, to be 10% is the footprint? So you could have a 600 square foot footprint with 2 stories, making it 1,200? Or is
Right,
that-
but no larger than 1,200
Got it.
total.
Okay, let's pause for a second. Did you want to comment on this, or
Yes.
did you want, okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. The Wild West is good, though. It's a good committee. So as we said last work session, I think separating basement, cellar, detached, or whatever we're calling them now, but dealing with them differently. And I think we're all agreeing that we want to grandfather the existing structures like garages.
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, we haven't gotten to that.
We haven't
yet.
got- okay, well, anyway.
I agree with that, but we haven't gotten to
Okay,
that.
yeah, so do I. But the 10%, I think, does make sense. I'm not against what you proposed either, Gwen, but realizing that you have different sizes on different lots and trying to recognize the concern that our R60s and our R90s are not created equal. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. But the question I had, I guess, for the combination of folks is, so you have and you were starting to do this, Jeff, what are the restrictions? So if we put the 1,200, which we've agreed in, maximum lot size, then you also have the lot coverage, like what are the other things that are at play? Constraining it in addition to, that's that sheet there.
Planning board did this fine standard sheet, which I had in various forms throughout my memo, on what are the current standards.
Could you just walk through that? Is that okay? I think that'd be helpful for people just to walk through that
So,
quickly.
Just to
Yeah.
tee it up, so we're shifting now to detached.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. That was kind of part of this.
As long
No,
as I
this
get
was a
notes
different-
on what the changes are that you want to make, I'm good.
Okay, let's go.
All right, so within the standards, we already talked about a little bit, the general lot coverage standard for R60, which has a 6,000 square foot minimum lot, is 35%. Unless you're doing infill development that was basically subdivided before 1978, and you're doing a new structure or more than 50% construction. In that case, the lot coverage is 30%. And that is true for R90 and, is it R200? And R200 as well.
And just, I want to pause on something you said there. You said unless you are doing a new structure or more than 50% construction. So I think it would be consistent to not require the lower lot coverage limit, because you're not doing more than 50% construction if you look at it by square footage.
I
Almost
only raised the
certainly.
30% because it is raised because you were asking about what about new
Yeah.
mansion is.
No, but it was important to kind of figure out why that might not be what we would want to do here.
And it would also apply if you allowed this in new structures.
Yeah.
So if you have totally new structures, you're gonna have
Right.
30%.
Then you're going to have 30%, yes, exactly. So if you did do a tear down and wanted to build an accessory dwelling unit, you're still going to be capped by 30% total lot coverage.
That's correct. You have the frontage of 60 feet in the R60 zone, front setback 25 feet, side setback 8. The sum of the side setbacks is 18, so you can, one has to be at least 10. It's a little bit weird. Rear setback is 20 feet for the principal building. That's not true of the accessory building, which I think is 12 feet setback. Oh, 5 rear?
Yeah.
5, sorry. It's the last book. Now, the accessory setbacks is 60 feet for the front, 5 from the side and 5 from the rear. That is essentially true in the other zones except R200, which has a rear setback of 7 and a front setback of 65. Oh, yeah, accessory apartments has its own setback of 12 feet from the rear. So it's always 12 feet minimum from the rear further. R90, 9,000 square foot minimum, 30% lot coverage as a general routine. It has a wider frontage of 75 feet. It is set back a little bit further, 30 feet instead of 25 feet. Side setback minimum is the same 8 feet. Some of the setbacks, though, is 25 feet.
Okay. Jeff, number 4 in your packet is the discussion of whether detached should be allowed in the zone, and then where is the size in your packet? Where do you get into the size?
Well, a little bit, I
Of
was
a
doing it
detached.
with minimum acreage size and talking about lot size differences as one way to,
Okay, well, and so Andrew's proposal is that it's 10%, the footprint of your detached unit is 10% of your lot size. Is that correct?
and that was on page 4.
And that's actually described on page 4? Yes, okay. So let's talk about that. I mean, to me, that doesn't sound unreasonable at all. Gwen, can I get some feedback? I heard what you said about trying to simplify things. It's not that unsimple, really. You just have to know your
Well, I think,
lot size. Right?
If I could just
Andrew,
chime in, to me, the simplification is the idea that the average resident doesn't know an R60 versus an R90 versus an R200 lot, and I think,
they do
you
know
know,
their lot
they
size.
do know their lot size, and my view is, you know, understanding, okay, you can build on 35%, you know, generally, or 30%, you know, doing it in numbers is not just easier for the.
But the 35% is gonna, you're not proposing to change.
No, I'm just saying that's what we are already making clear of
I mean, a simple-
what is the lot coverage that they can build on. And so my view is not only for the person who's building, but for the neighbors to understand what is and what is not allowed. To me, it's easier to have a lot coverage number. I mean, so my goal was to simplify it as well. And, you know, I think I would view the 10% as
The alternative
simplifying it.
simple approach would just be a cap on the volume of the unit that you can have at 1,200 feet, and then the site coverage constrains the footprint because you're bumping up against that. Now, that's not unsimple either, but your approach doesn't sound like it's necessarily, your approach also is a good way to go. I'm not sure if I see a real tell here as to what's better, but that's why we have DPS.
Yes, because we actually have to apply this. So we're hoping.
What's really simple?
Right, so we're hoping we could do something that makes sense in reality when it comes to application. 10% is certainly very workable. Having the cap, as you were talking about, for the total size of that unit is also very workable. The one caveat that we would put on the table, because I think people need to be thinking about this, in some of these areas, you might have a very, very small house. And what we're talking about here, and I'm talking about the principal dwelling, is we're talking about an accessory dwelling unit. Well, an accessory is something that is incidental and subordinate to the main unit. And if you have a postage stamp size house on an existing lot, at what point are you no longer having an accessory dwelling unit when you're coming at it from that perspective? And I just think that I'm putting it in front of the committee for your consideration, because I guarantee you that's going to be something we will see.
And what I was going to sort of add is it's a little bit, to some degree, whether you want to sort of allow one-story accessory dwelling units that can fill a large portion of a backyard, or if you want to emphasize, smaller two-story structures. I think
The two-story structure also kicks in additional setback requirements, and so I mean, there are additional restrictions that start to kick in once you get into two-story, which I think is appropriate. I just wanted to point that out. It's not as if an 800 square foot one-story structure and an 400 footprint, 800 square foot two-story structure are not created equally in terms of what their permissibility would be because of the height setback restrictions, correct?
If you're on a 6,000-foot lot, you're going to have a 600-foot footprint under Andrew's proposal. So it's true that if you wanted to create a cheaper detached unit and you wanted to be 800 feet, you can't do that now. You have to go up, and it's going to get a lot more expensive. I think that's what you were essentially signaling or calling attention to, is that it's this constraint may push people to go up if they want bigger than 10%, and
Right.
that's a massive cost increase when you start adding on a second story. That's just the other side of that equation.
Well, and, again, I think that it is I'm going to be very honest with you. I really have a hard time imagining folks building accessory dwelling units that are going to be much bigger than 800 feet in size or so. I went through actually just my own personal research. I went to Craigslist and I looked up all accessory and basement units in the whole DMV region, and most of them are of a size of 400 to 500 square feet. They are not, giant sized units. And I don't think we want actually someone to build a 1,200 square foot, one-story unit in their backyard, because that's like a small house. You don't really want that to happen.
Bigger than a lot of houses in my district, close.
Yeah, and
Older
so-
1950s close-in houses on R60 lots, a lot of
Yeah.
those are
And so that's-
1,100 square feet, three-bedroom cottages.
Why I think I think you could go either route, either say 10% of the lot coverage, but I actually think personally that should be the size of the entire accessory dwelling unit. So if you're in a 8,000 square foot lot, you should be allowed an 800 square foot dwelling unit, whether it's on one floor or two floors. If you're on a 10,000 square foot lot, you could be allowed a 1,000 square foot unit, whether it's on one floor or two floors. the other alternative way of doing it to be sort of simple.
Let's stop there for a moment.
Up there, okay.
Well,
But
two of my committee members have said they agree with it, so there's majority. But let's just talk about it.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah,
Hold on, doesn't that mean if it's a 20,000?
Claire.
No,
would
it's
you like to-
capped,
Oh,
but,
sorry, Claire,
but
I-
capped at 1,200. We're keeping the cap at 1,200. So I just want to clarify, this isn't infinite.
Yeah.
All right, so,
The idea is to focus it on the smaller lots, but still have the total cap, so we're never going to have one of
And
1,200.
the other thing about Kentlands is that that was a planned community where they took into consideration that this would be allowed, and that went into their APF and all their calculations. So Kentlands is a little different from the
We
rest.
do need to address this issue that you raised, though, about the postage stamp house, which is, I think, is an issue. There are many houses and lots like that, so this is a good start, but I don't think we've gotten to that.
one of the ideas is a maximum of 10%, allowing a 600 square foot building, or 50% of the footprint of the principal building, whichever is less.
And so long as we're staying away from habitable space, we can implement that.
That's the next.
That's the next one, and I think we're going to be, we're
Slide
going to
that
be,
in.
I don't want to speak for others, but I think
Everything in
I'm,
turn
I'm
here.
with you.
Okay.
I would
so
be, just to,
Let's go back to the lot distribution. You're not going to comment on that one yet.
no. I'm just, what Jeff just said, which is, which speaks to Mr. Jawando's point, I would personally be comfortable with, which is the 10% total square footage, 10% of the lot total square footage, 50% of the principal dwelling, whichever is less,
Can we go to the lot
which deals with the
distribution
postage.
slide?
All's in R60 or everywhere?
I think everywhere.
Well, I just raised this because if you limit it to 50% of the footprint of the existing house, you could have a very small principal structure and a very large lot. You could have a 20,000 square foot lot that happens to have a small house on it, and then say, oh, sorry, you can only be, if the footprint of the existing house is 1,200 square feet, you can only have a 600 square foot
Okay.
accessory. So I'm.
But it is an
Wait,
accessory unit.
Let's get to the 50% thing next. Let's just focus right now on, this shows the size of actual lots. So there are 10,000 lots that are less than 6,000 square feet. They're older lots. R50. Doesn't exist anymore, but they were built that way.
That zone is older than me.
Yeah. Anyone got a good joke right now I can use?
We're not into the historic preservation portion of the meeting.
Sometimes I draw blanks. So, let's say you got a 5,000 square foot lot, so then you're limited to a 500 square foot total accessory structure. Is there such thing, really? An accessory structure, Gwen, detached? I mean, but we're just talking detached. We're only talking detached.
But tiny houses are 400 to 500 square feet. I mean, 400.
Or less even, actually.
Yeah, I
I'll
mean,
just say it.
I don't think it's that likely because they're really expensive. So I think I agree with what has been said before, that these are going to be the less likely. But if you have a 5,000 square foot lot, I think 500 square feet is appropriate. Anything larger than that seems to be extremely large for what is an extremely small lot. I mean, these lots are so small, we don't even allow them anymore.
And don't forget, 500 square feet is a very reasonably sized one-bedroom apartment. In fact, as I think Councilmember Friedson mentioned, if you look at the tiny houses, none of them are even as big
They're like
as
200
500.
feet, something.
Right, they're 300 feet. And so, again, think about it as a garage. Even if you had a really small house, you would let people build a two-car garage.
The other thing is, remember, there are actually situations where you have lots as small as 3,000 square feet when you have cluster development. And reasonable people can disagree, but the example of Kentlands, I think, shows you can have very tight spacing of structures that's not aesthetically displeasing or necessarily incompatible. So I'm not saying you're on the wrong track, but before everybody gets too far down the line of let's.
We got a proposal here. I think we got both Andrew and Will agree, and I'm fine with this. This sounds fine to me. So I think we got a unanimous committee on that. Do we have more
Clarify it
discussion on
again?
this? Clarify it again, restate it
For
for the record.
detached units, now is it the maximum footprint or the maximum total?
Square footage.
All right, maximum square footage is 10% of the lot area, or 50% of the footprint of the principal building, whichever is less. Of footprint or total of the building is the next one. Should it be 50% of the footprint of the building or 50% of the square footage of the house?
I think it should be 50% of the square footage.
Okay. So both on square foot, okay. DPS, I'm sorry, Diane, can you live with that as in knowing knowing the floor area of a house?
We can figure out the floor area of a house.
Okay.
Better than habitable area.
Right.
What's habitable is up
All right, all right, I got it. So,
to- Okay.
excuse me?
So 10% or 50%,
Right, 10% or 50%, whichever is less.
whatever is less.
Right.
And so you wouldn't have a scenario where, well, Hans just mentioned on these R50 lots, or formerly known as R50. I'm trying to think of, are there scenarios where you could be really limiting the size in a way that's unintended here? I'm just trying to think through that. Gwen, do you?
Well, think about a really small, like, let's say 1,100 square foot house on a 6,000 square foot lot. I would say that's probably as small a house as, you find. And that would mean that you would be either 600 square feet, or if it was half of the 11, it would get you down to 550. So, it's not a huge difference, but you would only be able, in that case, to do 550, not 600. And think of that in terms, again, if you're trying to visualize 550 or 600, that's like a 3-car garage. So it would look a little strange if you had a small house but today they could build a 3-car
That's what I'm
garage
saying.
if they if they wanted to.
You could build a garage on there, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a good point. We're setting a smaller limit for when you can build a habitable structure.
Right.
You actually have a bigger limit for a non-habitable structure, or for a structure without a kitchen. Because you can actually build a bigger unit as a guest house next to your pool
That's the problem, yeah.
in the backyard.
So do we need the 50%? Could we just go with the 10%?
Well, I think the 50%, I mean, that addresses the accessory nature of the accessory dwelling unit, which is part of the purpose of this, and I think that does keep the lot being, continuing to stay in the same use that it previously was, just with more housing available, which I think is our ultimate goal here. So I think I'm very comfortable with where we've landed. I think it strikes the right
It's
balance.
your idea.
I'm extremely comfortable.
Well, if any of my colleagues have the courage and foresight to agree with me, I'm very comfortable.
All right, and now we have somewhat little bitty technical routines. We managed to insert in the ZTA as it was introduced the words habitable floor area, which is a weird phrase that would cause DPS to do more work than they really need to do.
Not get into that.
It's not even the work, it's just the arguments over what it means
Yeah.
and taking,
I think it's a new standard. I mean, I'm all for new ideas and being on the cutting edge, but this seems like the bleeding edge to me. And, I would propose that it's not something that's in the zoning code already. It's a new concept. I don't think, we're trying to create new housing, not new concepts in the zoning code. So I think there's agreement to go back to the standard of total floor area.
Right, and I would use the term gross floor area, which is a defined term that includes basement as well. So once you use the term gross floor area, you don't need to insert the word basement where this is issue 3 on page 5. it just becomes unnecessary.
We would agree with that. The one caveat is that when you're talking the within the dwelling, the basement area itself, but we would agree with that.
So gross floor area, I just want to make sure I'm clear. Gross floor area.
Gross floor area, that's what,
Everybody's comfortable with gross.
we all know what it is.
Look at all those heads nodding, this is amazing. That's because it's a defined term that everybody has,
I'm all for using defined terms.
there you go. Me-
Also, my mother's maiden name, so.
Gross?
I'll remember it.
Defined
yeah.
term?
Yeah, gross.
This is floor area?
You can tell her that everybody understands her then, I guess, I don't. Does she include a basement or not? Okay.
Where are we? Where are we?
All right, so you said yes to the next couple of questions there, really, at least to the staff report, so. And now it's the essential questions of how do you change the land use table? Do you want to allow these, now that you've regulated the size more too, in these detached small lot zones as detached units? You saw illustrations of that and how it works. It's your judgment on whether to change the table that way.
You're talking, wait,
So the question, the question before us is on height. I just
On
want to
number
make sure.
4.
Oh, you're talking about 4.
4.
Yeah.
are you back on habitable? What are you,
No.
Should detached ADUs be allowed as a limited use?
Page 6, number, issue.
page 6, number 4.
He's just circling back to reaffirm that what you're saying is you. think
Yes,
that
they should be allowed as a
units
limited use in these
should
zones.
be allowed in
As
the-
we have,
Under the terms we.
according to the framework we've established.
All right, now you have heights for detached units, and accessory structures have a different heights than the principal structures. It's 20 feet. Now, you can do, if you're creative enough, 2 stories within a 20 feet height limit. Remember, there's ways to measure that with the type of roof that you're using or not. The typical floor to ceiling height is 8 feet. As sort of a standard.
So this is what's allowed presently, right?
That's correct.
You want to build a garage right now, you can, or a pool house, or a non-kitchen including guest house, or a studio, a home office, any of these things you can do right now, and you got a 20-foot height limit, is that right?
Yes. And if you're comfortable with that, that's fine.
Well, let's find out. Will, and then Andrew.
I think these are fine, just again with I don't want to have anyone have to tear down anything that they already have that's taller, so I think grandfathering in, but I think these height restrictions are fine.
All right.
So we talked before, I feel similarly, we talked a little bit at the last meeting about the question of the garage and building above the garage. And if you add a floor, what is the threshold? I just want to have a little bit of clarity there because we kind of started that discussion. I don't know that we ever ended it conclusively. But the difference between adding a floor, you could have a 15-foot single-story structure that wouldn't be adding a floor, but if you go to 20 feet, 2 10-foot stories, what is the point at which it's adding a floor that would kick in additional height? I just want to make sure we have clarity on that.
This relates.
That might be a DPS question, but.
It is a DPS question. This relates to accepting an existing, and we'll find out whether you want to add the term legal or not, legally constructed accessory building as an ADU without regard to setbacks. What would trigger a setback review is either an extension upstairs or an extension outward from that. That would make you subject to the setback requirements. But with regard to heights in general and setbacks in general, once you're above 15 feet, you have a 2-for-1 additional minimum setback to the extent that you're above 15 feet. So a 20-foot building would require another 10-foot setback on that side. So I know I related two different things here, but I think that's what you were talking about with the,
Right.
with the structure.
And I think the one other kind of wrinkle to throw in here is the question of a three-story unit in an R200 zone. The way that I read this, and unless I'm mistaken, we would be allowing a three-story, I guess it'd be a 400 square foot unit, 3 stories up. I mean, it would be very expensive to build. I don't know that anybody's actually going to build that because it seems to be unnecessarily expensive. You'd probably build a 12 on an R200, more likely to build a 1,200 square foot unit on one story because it'd be cheaper. But just from a policy standpoint, we are allowing a 3-story structure.
In the principal building only.
In R200, unless I'm misreading this, R200, it seems to be permissible use, right? Or,
Go that height.
And that is from the existing rules for accessory buildings. So as Councilmember Reamer said, if you were building a home office.
or Mr. Reamer's 3-story pool houses.
Or a studio or a pool house.
We're all dreaming about having a pool house, so we.
Have somebody to film your music video.
I mean, it does seem tall to me. You may want to,
So unlikely, right?
and also very unlikely.
We have to legislate for possibilities.
Are we, okay.
There were like so many things just said in that little discourse there before Gwen spoke. So can I just dispel one thing at a time?
Please.
So you started with the concept of if you have a 15-foot, a garage with a 15-foot ceiling, does that mean that you can only add a 5-foot story? So you really are putting yourself out of the ability to do that. And the answer is no, you're not putting yourself out of the ability to do it. The point is how you're going to construct it, because presumably you're not going to be retaining a 15-foot high ceiling in your garage, but you're going to be modifying it so that you can have the floor plate that you need to have above it. And so you might have a lower ceiling. So it is still doable as long as you're staying within the height. That
Right,
was-
I guess my question is less about whether or not it's doable. I think I understood that. I think the question is whether or not creating the second story, even though it's only 5 feet, whether that triggers a new structure,
It would trigger,
because it's 2 stories instead of 1 story.
it would trigger, well, it would
And that changes setback requirements and others.
requirements. It would definitely change the setback requirements.
Right. That was the point that I was trying to make, not whether or not it was doable or you're gonna build a 5-foot structure. Most people wouldn't fit in a 5-foot structure.
So again, in this example, you have a 1-story, and it was a 12-foot rear setback. And if you go to the 2-story example, it needs to be a 15-foot setback because it's 2 stories. So it affects the setback most. The height is still always 20 feet. That doesn't change. What adding a second floor does is affect your setback, and it makes you set the building back some
And-
additional feet.
And particularly in the smaller zones.
Yes.
Where the structure is probably relatively close to the lot line. These are older, tend to be older neighborhoods. Changing whether it's grandfathered, whether that structure would be grandfathered in or not, because if you're building a second story, then that becomes a new structure, and therefore it would not be allowed, to build the second story on it.
Right, if you have a 2-car garage that exists today on your lot, and it's close to the lot line, and you say, I want to do an accessory dwelling unit, if you literally just gut that garage, put up new windows, do things, and turn it into a 400 square foot accessory dwelling unit, you wouldn't have to pick it up and change the setbacks. But if you start getting creative and saying, I'm going to expand it out another 100 feet, or I'm going to add a second floor to it, or something like that, then you're running into setback problems.
And I'd like to just, if I may, jump in on this, because you may not see it yet. The setbacks are there for a reason, and when you're going up, and they're very impactful on the communities. And I can guarantee you that if these start coming up in the being built into setbacks where you've got people's window, new windows and new dwelling units, literally almost to the property lines for their neighbors, this is very impactful on a community, and you will hear about it, I will hear about it, and you will hear about it.
That's why we're not proposing to.
Right, we're
change
not,
the
we're not
setback.
proposing to change that. We did get a very detailed proposal from a architect builder, Paul Geiser, recommending we allow all the structures to go to their lot line, but I don't think anyone's really thinking that that's where we should go.
The conversation was about first of all, you'd have to talk about an existing structure that is constructed legally, a garage that was constructed legally versus not constructed legally. And we completely agree with the planning board's recommendation that if it was not legally constructed to start with, that doesn't become your basis for what you're doing. So.
Can't build on an illegal structure, make it legal, yeah.
Okay, let's keep moving here.
Okay, keep it moving. We're on page
So,
7.
With the
issue
minimum
number
1 acre,
6,
yes.
which is minimum lot size. The ZTA deletes the 1 acre minimum lot size, and of course, because it's applying that to small lot zone. So before the minimum, the zone where you could apply a detached house had a 1 acre minimum lot, so the 1 acre minimum was in there. I had made recommendations if you.
Yep, we're settled on this one. Let's
You
keep-
settled on, so you want to so the easy thing to do here is just delete the minimum,
Exactly.
Yeah, we've addressed it through the
Right.
previous provision.
right?
That Councilmember Friedson is very in favor of.
One that he-
Now, who made that proposal again? I forgot, okay.
Keep this going, because it's
Keep
fun.
this going. Page 8, there was a separation requirement in the current code that said you couldn't be too close to another ADU. And this was to prevent what was thought might occur as an over-concentration.
Yeah,
of
I
ADUs.
want to describe this one. This is a classic council compromise where people said, well, I favor ADUs. I'm just going to make sure you can't have more than one every 300 feet. And this is the kind of compromise that completely eliminated the ability to build these units, I think, substantially around the county. So, we really do need to remove that one. Councilmember Friedson has asked for some type of study. I think we could ask the planning board for some more thoughts about what kind of, review that they could. I do think it would be good to get a regular report on the units. I don't know if anyone has proposed that already, but I think be fine to have an annual.
Yeah, my strong view is, I don't disagree. I'm not, I don't have reservations about deleting it, because I actually think a person who has an accessory dwelling unit, the person most willing to be okay with having an accessory dwelling unit as their next door neighbor is a person who's just constructed an accessory dwelling unit. And if they have an issue with it, I think, to a certain extent, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And, just to speak of the Portland example, since that's was raised a little bit earlier today, they have 10 times as many ADUs being constructed, and the total amount of housing that have ADUs on them is 1.3%. And so I just don't subscribe to the idea that every house and every, in a neighborhood is going to construct these units. It just doesn't seem likely to me, but I do think that as we've discussed this, particularly that question, because I think that the numbers will bear out the way that we have talked about it, that they won't be in the concentration that some have suggested that there might be, but also all of the other examples of data that has been inconclusive and somewhat unclear at times, and different numbers talking about different things, that having a regular report, 2 years from now and then moving forward, whether it's planning, whether it's DHCA or somebody else to
That the
to
report
do it.
just be a report on the units created. I don't think we should ask anyone to submit a report determining whether there is a problem. I think that is an inherently, community input and council member determination process.
Yeah, I don't mean this as a feedback.
That's just the way Jeff described it. It said something like, a requirement to study if overconcentration is a problem. If we were to actually embrace that language, I think it creates a pretty problematic framework for reporting.
I also would say you really couldn't judge that on an annual basis. That would be something maybe you'd have to study like every 5 years or something
so-
like that.
I mean more of like size, location. I mean,
Sure.
I think it'd be helpful for us to know what is the result of
absolutely.
the
I totally
bill,
agree.
where they're
I
being
think-
built, how big
that
they're
will
being, how
allow
many are
people
2
to-
stories, what are the detached versus attached or in.
So can we add a requirement to produce to DHCA? Can we get some feedback on a
Or does that have to be on a separate bill?
separate
Well,
bill?
again, if you.
It's this is a
you are the-
ZTA.
George Will said the problem with the legislature is all their laws are jokes, but all their jokes are law. In this case, you can require it by law, or you can ask them, or you
Yeah, I
can
think we could
control
just
the
ask
you
DHCA
control
for
parking
an
findings
annual
report.
report.
You don't have to do this by law.
Thank you. Well said.
Yeah, so we already map where all the ADUs are now, and if there's specific information that you want to see, we can just track it, put it up on Data Montgomery, and you can have it in real time. If you want an annual report, we can certainly give it to you.
That goes for the community as well. If the community thinks that there should be some type of data provided that is not presently available, they could reach out to DHCA, and if it works, you can make it happen.
Yeah, if it'd be okay with you, I think it would be helpful just to have as an annual to the committee, just because then it kind of makes it more of a public proactive document. But I appreciate Mr. Zients including it. I think it slightly characterized what I was asking for in more of a negative context than I had intended. And so I just wanted to clarify that, but I think that the data does matter, and I think it would be helpful for the public and for us as policymakers.
Forgive the negative connotation, I had a Jewish mother.
I would just say, agree with removing this, to Councilmember Reamer's point. If someone builds one first and then your mom becomes a senior citizen, you want to move her in, you can't because that doesn't make any sense. So I think that's an equity issue as well, and so, and fairness issue. So, but also agree with the reporting. It would be great just to know for a number of reasons where they're being built, how they're being built, and how all that's going. So
I have to share the story. One of the most angry emails that we received was from a community, and I met the author of it, president of the Civic Association, and he actually lives in an accessory dwelling unit. And he said, "Yeah, I actually think it's a great type of housing. I just, I don't think that we should have them, otherwise, other than the one that he built for his family, because his family relocated from another part of the county, and they together live in a one family in the principal structure, one family in the accessory dwelling unit." It's like, okay, that's Montgomery County for you right there.
So we don't need to legislate, but we've now formally requested this report.
Right,
wanna
we'll,
clarify, okay.
we'll at least put it in the background to this and communicate with DHCA.
who we just got a thumbs up from.
Thumbs up, absolutely.
Thumbs are up. Claire.
Okay.
Thumbs not so up.
No, the only thing I was going to say is that the intractable problem that bothers a lot of communities is the number of accessory apartments that they know of that are in the dark, that are not legal. I think that that's something that you have to think about, is a way to get people to come into compliance so that those numbers really mean something.
That's a good
Because
point. I
if you
think
have
that's
4 or
part of our
5
intent. Yeah.
Well, intent is good, but having,
Well, we do
figuring
think
that
people
out.
should not have unlicensed and illegal units.
if your data is going to be correct, it would be good to be able to reduce that number.
No, I think that's right. And I talked about last time having a dedicated effort, which we could do maybe under other legislation, along with code enforcement, which we talked about, to bring people out of the shadows, so to speak, and not have penalties, for people to come up and update and encourage in an education way and a kind of amnesty way to do that. I agree with you. We need to have the right data, and I want to work with you all. I don't think the ZTA here is the place to do that, but I think we do need to do that.
So the amnesty aspect of it, amnesty from failing to register or get the license is one thing. But if you have changed your home into with an accessory unit, and it's not compliant, doesn't have the fire safety kinds
Right,
of
no, not-
protections, or
yeah.
the ventilation kinds of protections, that we would not want to have as.
Of course, yes, I agree. I'm more referring to DHCA's, the permitting, just anything we can encourage people to come out and say, hey, it's not as scary as you think. We're doing a new effort. Let's get and I think the timing would be good along with the passing of the CTA.
And the other thing to think about is the ability of DHCA to process the applications. I know that you don't think that process is a problem, but it is. So if you're opening up the possibility for more of these to come in, if you don't have the support, if you don't have the capability to handle them in a timely manner, that's another thing that you have to address.
Yeah, we appreciate it. I think you have the support here of the council, but, ultimately enforcement, no matter what we do, enforcement is an executive function. The processing of applications are an executive function, and so we need to be working together. I mean, we want to be productive partners here and provide the resources that are necessary and, and do what we can from the legislative branch, but, ultimately, I think you've heard a commitment here for that, but I think ultimately we need the support, participation, active engagement of the executive branch to help us to make sure that the enforcement is happening, to make sure that we're helping folks to do things the right way and not the wrong way, to follow the law. And I think that the whole premise of making things a little bit easier is the idea that we want people to do these legally. We know that they're doing them more often than we would like illegally, and we would like them to do them legally and have a framework in order to make that happen. And I think that the way that we can make this happen is on our end, have the commitment, and commitments mean money from a legislative branch. And I think we will look forward to working together with the executive branch to hear what is needed. But, ultimately, we need the support of the executive branch to make sure that these are happening. And that's why I appreciate the fact that you're here.
So just to clarify, and you can take the girl out of the law office, but you really can't get the law office out of the girl, as I like to say. So for my friends at the end of the table over there, just to be realistic, there can be programs that, whatever DHCA wants to come up with to encourage people to come out of the dark, as Claire said. The reality on enforcement, though, particularly on things happening within housing, is that you can't just go in and storm the castle. That in order, if there is, no matter how many complaints you get, in order to actually go in and inspect, you have to be able to get the proper administrative warrant if there is a problem. That is easier said than done. So just to put a dose, I'm the Duchess of Doom here, to put a little dose of reality, though, on how this will all shake out.
And we should talk more about that process. How high of a threshold is it, and how often are you doing it? But I agree with you, but I think you're hearing a commitment from everybody here to work through those not insignificant enforcement and challenges, but at the same time trying to balance the need for this new type of affordable housing for people and flexibility, so.
Yeah, it's a challenging budget, though. So there's only one person who now handles the applications, and it's my understanding she does it as one of 3 or 4 other things that she does. So there is a financial, if this is a mandate for more of these, then right now it's an unfunded mandate, so to speak. So that is something that we have to work on.
We will need to look more closely at how DHCA handles all of the work that could be created and how enforcement will, what kind of enforcement regime we'll have. Those are all subsequent conversations, so appreciate that.
And that being said, I just want to note that simplifying the rules, I think, will go a long way with what we are able to do. And in terms of enforcement, we receive a lot of complaints about a number of different issues. I do want to say that 4 out of every 10 complaints that we receive for housing code enforcement regarding illegal ADUs are unfounded. So 40%.
Does that mean that they're not ADUs?
There's no issue. There's no illegal ADU. That does mean that there's 6 out of 10 are problems, But 40%, almost half of them are not issues, so I do want to state that.
Thank you. That's a good fact to keep in mind. So let's continue. We've got some big items still to get through.
At the bottom of page 8, also issue 8 is what should the parking requirement be or not be? Currently for an ADU, you need one more than is otherwise required by the zone.
Okay, let's pause on that. So currently you need one more than is otherwise required by the zone. Now, much of the county was built out post, what year was it, 1975 around, when 2 spaces became the norm. A house had to be built with 2 spaces. 78. So much of the county was built with 2 spaces, and so the requirement for those houses is 1 more space, so 3 spaces total. That's a long driveway or a very, very wide driveway, or you don't have enough, you know. Many houses that are older, however, could have been built, we don't know, it depends, with 1 space or 2 spaces or no spaces. It's just a case-by-case basis. It depends on how that homeowner, if it was an individual property that was built or a particular development. So there's some variation with the older homes as to how much driveway capacity they have. And so what I had proposed was that, Jeff, where is the language of what's in my ZTA?
I think yeah, top of 9.
Top of 9. So you've got to have either 2 on site, or you have to go for the waiver. So that means in an older home, if you have no driveway, yeah, you're going to either have to build 2 on site, or you're going to have to go for the waiver. And the waiver is a determination of how much street space is available. There's a factual basis that the hearing examiner would apply. Is this a really crowded street where every inch of curb is used, most of the time? Then there's probably not room for another vehicle. Or is this something where, yeah, generally speaking, you can get a spot on the street? In that case, there is room. So that's what I propose, that if you can't meet the 2 parking spots on your site, so you always have to have at least 2, or else you have to go for the waiver. That's where we are. If anyone wants to propose a different approach, we could take that up. Now, is there anything really, really important that needs to be added to what I just explained, Jeff?
Just that under the existing code, the older home that didn't have a driveway before would be required to have 2 under the current code today. That's not a change to the current code. What your change does is where 2 were already required and existed on site, that 3rd one would not be required.
Thank you. Right. Which seems reasonable to me, but okay. Andrew.
Go first. I'll go after.
Yeah, so I kind of see this both ways. On the one hand, parking is probably the number 1 issue that I hear from folks in terms of their concern about what impact this is going to have on their street. And I think we need to be sensitive to that and recognize that that is a real legitimate issue, particularly in the areas where I think, based on the heat map, these are going to be taken up most likely. And so in that sense, have some inclination to revert back to what was previously passed and what is currently the parking standard for 2, which would become 3. Having said that, I am also sensitive to the fact that we too often assume that everybody's going to have a car, which is a very outdated way to view it. And so my view is, 1, I think that we would be best served if these were incentivized to be closer to where transit is. And 2, recognizing that if somebody who lives in proximate area to transit is less likely to have a car just naturally, and we shouldn't assume that they are having a car, and we shouldn't be charging the cost of, subsidizing their rent in order to pay back the cost of this process to pay for a car that they may not need, and make it, basically, we shouldn't be incentivizing that as, from a public policy standpoint, given our environmental sustainability goals and where we're trying to move towards. So I have suggested that we maintain the existing standard except in areas that are proximate to transit. I'm open to what walking distance that is. I think a half mile is appropriate. That's proximate to transit, but again, I'm open to flexibility there, but that would, I think, balance, in my view at least, the goal of not assuming that everybody is going to have a car, particularly those who are choosing to live near transit. Those are also, by the way, the most expensive properties in the county. Two, to recognize the fact that in many areas, parking is the number one concern that I hear from the greatest number of people.
We have one complication here from Tacoma Park, not the Tacoma Park.
Do we need to address that here, or can we address that in the municipalities section? They want a more liberal policy even than this. They want to
Right,
basically handle it
I
themselves.
don't want to lose that thought. You
Yeah.
have to do it.
I don't either. I want to make sure we address Tacoma Park, but let's resolve what we think with it outside of Tacoma Park first.
Thank you. And, this is similar to Councilmember Friedson. This is the thing you hear about the most is the parking. And looking at the heat map, I live in East County. A lot of people drive. There are a lot of cars. Parking's an issue now, whether they're illegal or not, or legal ADUs, or just people doing multifamily housing. And so it's just an issue, just regardless, when you take ADUs off the table, parking's an issue. And so, I would tend to agree that keeping the current requirement also open to the transit alternative. Maybe you do a waiver. The other thing is a lot of people are still driving, near transit, even if you are near transit. So I don't know if assuming that they're not going to drive there is the right thing as well. And so I don't know if there's a way to do a waiver in that situation and just, showing that if you're near transit, you can have a waiver for that extra spot. But that's kind of where I'm thinking too. It's a real problem. Many people drive, and I know Mr. Anderson wants to say something, so go ahead.
Well, I had a suggestion that I hope could be perhaps combined with Mr. Friedson's suggestion. Acknowledging that when you're not close to transit, there may be parking issues, and there also may be a higher likelihood that the tenant's going to drive. Perhaps you could have a blanket exception for the parking requirements for places that are proximate to transit.
How proximate being?
Well, whether it's half a mile or three-quarters of a mile. I mean, I live basically 4 blocks from the Silver Spring Metro, and that's half a mile. I see people walking past my house every single day from the neighborhood even further away to get to the Metro. I think I would consider my neighborhood highly transit accessible, and even the ones, so we can, I think.
Talk about that.
Yeah, right.
Let's finish your point. So
But,
have it be a
but
blanket.
park that to one side, no pun intended.
Right.
The places that are not transit proximate, if there could be an objective standard to evaluate whether or not there's sufficient on-street parking, this is what gets people hung up a lot. Because once you go into a waiver process and you have to go to a hearing examiner, I think a lot of people, including people I've talked to in my neighborhood, are very put off by the idea of like, how do I deal with this bureaucracy?
Right.
So if we could avoid that, but still acknowledge that there are neighborhoods that don't have sufficient parking. And what the planning board recommended was perhaps examining how much frontage you have in front of your house. If you're in a neighborhood where you have a very, especially these larger lot neighborhoods, which tend to be further away from the downtowns and the transit. If you have enough room to park 3 cars in front of your house, plus whatever you have in your driveway, maybe we should consider that sufficient presumptively, so you don't have to go to a waiver. Whereas if you're in a very small lot zone where you've only got, 30 feet free and clear of the driveway and any fire hydrants or whatever, and if you'd like, you could even include some provision about the street width, because I've heard a lot of people say, well, in my neighborhood, you can only drive basically one way down the street because there's people
That's very true.
parked. Yeah, I've seen neighborhoods like that, certainly near downtown Silver Spring. There's some places where that's an issue. So if there's sufficient street width that you can park on both sides of the street and still leave two-way traffic, and you have frontage in front of your house. Now, nobody owns the right of way in front of their house, but that suggests that there is enough space in your neighborhood generally for people to be parking on the street without being too concerned about everybody having a driveway.
And how would you could do that based on, we wouldn't have to be site visiting. You have the technology to be able to tell
Well,
what that is.
DPS could go out and measure what the frontage is. So frontage, and again, I would say clear of,
No problem, Diane.
right, it's easier.
I see Diane grabbing for her measuring tape as we speak.
Volunteer the Duchess of Doom here to go, and if I could, and that's really, do you have that on your business card? That would be really cool.
But I'm just wondering, are you going to be giving me money to my budget to help me
Well,
measure
if you-
everybody's
if-
front
Could I just speak to Mr. Joyner? I would be okay, just to your point, and I appreciate the thought with which you've come forward with this proposal, but I'd be, if you were concerned about having it not be a waiver situation, I'd be okay with saying, reverting to the current parking standard, moving it to a mile from transit and allowing a waiver of up to, within a mile of transit. And I think we could even consider BRT.
That's what I was.
No, that's what he proposed. I had said you should just be able to do it and not assume it, but if that's something that you feel strongly. Yeah, please.
I don't think we should try to invent something else here. We have a waiver process. It exists. The hearing examiner has it. So Casey, what you want exists. We have a waiver process. It's not, the criteria isn't what you explained, which is something based on the frontage, but there is a pretty clear process today that the hearing examiner
But what
has
for
for waivers.
and I've tried to contain myself.
It's not a special exception waiver, though. It's
But
just.
this is the jugular vein.
Well, okay, before you go down.
Sure.
I don't, we can ask the hearing examiner to explain what the hearing waiver is, and I think it does make sense to be clear about that. But personally, what I would be willing to support is what Councilmember Friedson had suggested was no additional requirement for parking within a half mile. I would say within a mile. And I would say not, I think you did say Metro and Purple Line.
And Purple Line, yeah.
Yeah. And then leave the existing requirements in place outside of a mile, which I think is what you had said, but I'm not sure, contingent upon that waiver being available to people who are outside of a mile. So you don't need a waiver inside of a mile. It's just there's no additional parking requirement. But outside of a mile, you have the current requirements, which for some homes is fine and for some homes is tricky, but then they have to go, if they don't want to build that extra space, then they have to go through the waiver.
Go ahead, Alan.
So that to me, I think it's okay. Like, I think it's, it's not the most liberal policy, but I think it's responsive to the concerns, and I think it's probably workable almost, most of the time. But, so do you want to talk about that?
Yes.
Do you have alternatives to that? Would it be helpful to hear from someone, do we have anyone here who can explain the hearing examiner's current waiver?
It's sort of a subjective standard. I have to go look it up again. It says whether
Efficient parking?
whether there's sufficient parking on the street. And he is going through the first round of these waivers since the council changed this.
We could put in some more specific criteria to.
You could say, if the street is 44-foot wide, which is two 10-foot parking lanes and two 12-foot travel lanes, and the,
Huge neighborhood street.
well, I mean, that's what,
A parking aisle should be 8 feet, and a travel lane should be at a maximum in a residential neighborhood, 10 feet. So I'd say.
Well, I don't
32.
like the approach of based on, if you have a narrow street but there's plenty of parking, I don't know why we would say you shouldn't be able to have one.
The simplest way to do this would be to say, we should assume every 20 feet of frontage you have that's not in front of a fire hydrant or driveway is available for parking. A parallel parking space is typically 20 feet long, roughly. So if you've got 40 feet of space in front of your house, I don't understand why you shouldn't be allowed to count that as parking, considering you could park a boat in front of it if you wanted to today. You could park your work.
It's lawn or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't park a boat there. Okay.
But a utility van that you're using for
But a
work,
large
whatever.
Buick.
A large Buick, exactly, a Cadillac.
Yes, that you can.
Cadillac.
But under that standard, we have no parking problem because we have a 60-foot frontage required.
Irrespective of whether there's parking available. And the proposal allows for some judgment as to whether there is actually parking available.
May I,
Please.
Please.
keeping my Duchess
Duchess.
of Doom hat back on, is on. So DPS is really somewhat agnostic as to, some aspect of what you're talking about here. However, there is a reality that narrow streets still need to have fire department access. And the purpose of a waiver looks at things that would include things like this, so that if there are too many, if you want to come in and not provide for the parking on your site, and that street is very narrow or has other constraints, and every street in Montgomery County, I dare say, is different, has specific requirements, then the hearing examiner would hear from the fire marshal, who is DPS, on whether or not there's an access issue. And I don't think that we want a rule that would not allow us to be able to look at these, because that's a really important factor.
Look at
So,
fire access.
Yeah, just to respond to Councilmember Reamer's, I think, adjusted proposal, I definitely okay with the secondary part. Let's start there with outside of a mile, keeping the current process, current rules in place. I think there's, some people will take transit, but some won't within a mile, and I still think it's a neighborhood by neighborhood thing, and the size of the width of the roads, how many families are living on a block, how many ADUs are on a block, is there a permit process for the parking on that block already or not? I mean, there's a lot of variables, and so I am concerned about just saying blanket within a mile, cutting it back. Go ahead, Claire.
The other thing is, there is a national standard for a walk shed, which is a half a mile, so you've just doubled it. So,
That's not
I
accurate.
don't believe
information,
that's the state of the
actually. Let's
process.
not get into that.
Yeah, so
oh, why wouldn't you get into it? If you're talking about.
Because I'm the chair of the
reason-
committee, I'd like to focus on the issue at hand, which is, we have a proposal, which is a mile, and we're either going to accept that or reject that. So,
Well, I'd like, if you're still amenable to going to my initial waiver within a mile,
So
that's why I'm more
how much?
comfortable there.
Yeah, how much, so the hearing examiner, what's the cost of going to the hearing examiner specifically on getting a parking waiver? Because I think that's
I
important.
think it's just through the licensing requirements. I don't know that there's a separate fee for the waiver.
If there is a fee, it's very small, but just in terms of it used to be a conditional use and now it's a waiver process. There were only 12 or 13 conditional uses applied for in the last 4 years, all of which were approved. Some of that's parking, some of that's proximity.
this is not a conditional use.
No.
Yes. But so it used to be a conditional use, now this is a part of the waiver process. As a part of the waiver process for parking, DHCA would go out in the morning, in the afternoon, at night, take a look. Is there available parking for this?
So it sounds like you're saying it's not an extreme barrier to access. I'm just concerned because of the
Exactly,
nature of
it's not.
neighborhoods, we want to keep that in even within a mile, just because
Yeah,
everything's different.
But the only concern that I have here is what the standard is, because my whole point originally, and I wanted to raise this when I was speaking to your point, I'm okay with it, but for the fact that if the waiver process assumes that that person has to have a car, and therefore we need to, that the third car creates a burden on the neighborhood, as opposed to saying, I am renting it to somebody who works in a place that doesn't need a car, that isn't going to have a single occupancy car. And so the whole purpose of why I'm bringing this forward is to say, why are we going to force somebody to pave an impervious surface driveway to create two spaces to replace the one space that they're taking away from the street in order to provide housing for somebody and increase the cost of that housing if that person is not, going to use a car. And so that's the That's what I want to be sensitive towards. And so I just want to make sure that that I'm not losing the forest for the trees.
Well, no, I think that it's a mistake to put in additional driveway requirements especially within a mile of metro. I think that that is going to add a huge amount of expense to this housing construction. And there actually are properties that can't do it. The only way to do it is to pave over some part of the front yard or some part of the backyard. And, it's not actually as desirable to make people pave some part of their yard for an additional parking spot as it is to have them park on the street.
And you don't think the waiver is enough to allow that not to happen? Because under the waiver process, you wouldn't have to do that if, is what we're saying here. And I agree with you. If you can say, hey, we're near transit, I'm going to use transit, you go in and get the
That's what I'm
waiver.
concerned.
Well,
If
I
the
don't
waiver
think
process
DPS is
is-
going to give you, I don't think
That's
DPS
the
is
issue.
going to, I don't think there's a way to say, well, this applicant has said that they're going to use transit. So we'll allow that. I don't think that that's
I see some passive.
viable.
Can someone speak to that?
Because I think you're trying to do something that's sort of neutral to,
I think that, again, let's think about some specific examples. In Councilmember Weimer's original proposal, it's saying if you want to have an accessory dwelling unit, you have to have on your property 2 on-site parking spaces or have the hearing examiner find that a waiver is appropriate. What that would mean, let's take a small house in East Silver Spring that maybe has one small driveway that one car could fit on. For them to put in an accessory dwelling unit, they would have to figure out a way to expand their driveway, to pave their front yard, to build a garage, to do something to add a second parking space.
including a basement unit.
And that would even include if they were doing an internal unit, not a detached unit. They would have to do that, or they'd have to go to the hearing examiner to find that a waiver is appropriate. And we've talked about the fact that there may be a need to add a few sentences under a different section, 2926B, about what the waiver criteria in this situation might be, and we can talk about that separately. But that's a pretty strict provision. This is Councilmember Reamer's provision. That's a pretty strict provision in and of itself. If you have, again, 2 on-site spaces in a more suburban area, let's, take Olney or something like that, you'd be fine.
So it's assuming, so you're saying it disproportionately will impact the tighter end folks that don't have access necessarily to those parking spaces already.
And it will make it much more expensive. Extending a driveway or building a garage or another parking space adds a huge amount of expense if you just want to rent out your basement.
And let's not forget Tacoma Park, which is one of the communities that would be the most likely, I think, is saying, we don't want any parking requirements here. We don't want to have to pave over our yards and add 10, 15,000 or more to the expense of this. We just want to have a more relaxed approach to this requirement. And so, not every municipality may feel that way, but I think it's significant that they feel that way.
But it is important to note that this applies not just to the expensive detached units that we've talked about. It applies to if you just want to rent out your basement.
Let's talk about that for a second. Is there a way to, there's a difference between if you're building a detached family-used unit as opposed to you having a basement ADU where there's one occupant, in the amount of parking that might result.
If it's a 1,500 square foot
Well,
basement.
we've limited it now.
There's a 2-adult limit
So there's 2 adult limit.
in either place.
So you're assuming one or more, maybe one isn't driving, one isn't.
I
but-
mean,
Okay.
what's ironic is today, and I gave this example before, people can rent out individual
Sure.
rooms in their house. And you can be a divorced person and decide you need to rent out rooms, and you have 3 people with cars. If you did one ADU in your basement, you would have probably 1 car.
Okay, so we have a amended proposal of 1 mile. There's no additional requirement outside of 1 mile. It's either the current requirements, which
Which is
one additional,
one additional,
or it's waiver.
right.
And obviously, the applicant has a choice of either of those. And we will look a little bit more at the waiver issue. But we have a committee recommendation there.
3-0.
Okay, so, and that's a 1 mile, no additional requirement,
Of Metro or Purple Line.
right? Okay. All right. Now we're on additions. This is issue 9 on page 10. We used to have a maximum of how much you could add to your house to provide for that new ADU of 800 square feet. We went through some of these size requirements. You know, certainly, there are some savings to having an attached ADU rather than detached. You're not extending your utilities as far. You need one less wall because you're attached to the unit.
So the current code has a limit on the
800 square feet. That's
800, and the ZTA that I recommended
Has none.
Does not have a
No
limit.
limit.
You're just bound by the other constraints
Right.
of lot coverage and things like that. Okay. Does anyone feel that we should have a different limit than the other limits that we've already established? Or
Again, you could look at this as
on the
a
9, yeah.
cost maximization issue, if you will, that you don't want.
I mean, all right, so what I've recommended is that we do not specifically establish a limit for the addition size
Right.
related to an ADU. I think you could have a limit, I don't,
Yeah, I guess the only question is, I just want to make sure we're kind of unpacking this. We have differentiated, which is a new at the committee today, we've differentiated the detached versus the attached. This would be attached, and I just want to make sure that, I guess philosophically, I don't see any reason why we would allow somebody to put a addition on their house
Well,
that goes to the setback and, all the other restrictions, but not an ADU addition, in terms of what the impact is on the
You
neighborhood.
can certainly apply those standards you said for the maximum detached also to the attached.
you could say if you're
E-
on a
e-
5,000-foot lot, then the maximum addition you can have is 500 feet.
Right, and it might be partially addition.
Well, that
and
could be
part-
less than the lot coverage limit that you could have if you were to tear down the house and put up a mansion. Right? So why get into it? I mean, we've got the limit here.
You're
I don't think we need to add an additional, is my
Okay.
view. Yeah.
I don't feel strongly, so. I just wanted to raise the issue because we did slightly change what we were talking about. So I just want to make sure that we were considering.
Yeah, I thought you sort of wanted that, at least the 12,000 square feet.
12,000 is a really big ADU. I would love to live in a 12,000 square foot
1,200
ADU.
is still the limit of an ADU,
Right,
You
so
know,
that applies to attached.
so it's going to apply. So it's like, yeah.
12,000 square foot ADU is Hans's pool house he mentioned earlier.
I keep
You
forgetting.
can't build a
about-
1,600-foot addition.
Right.
And then make it an ADU. You're still capped.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it.
Already handled.
I missed a joke there, but I'll come back to that later.
all right, now it's whether you can build a new duplex or quasi-duplex.
Okay, this is the door, where the door has to be?
Well, it's both, there, it's, the
Oh, this
first
is
thing
the-
is.
the
is
5
whether-
years.
Whether it
5
needs to
years.
be 5 years old or not.
Yeah.
So,
And it's, again, it depends upon whether you want to allow that tear down for the sake of somebody building 2 new units on the site.
okay, so I recommended that you should be allowed to build a new ADU if you are building a new house, I think I can definitely envision a family wanting to, purchasing a small house and wanting to build themselves a new modified house with a backyard cottage. That is actually, I understand that there's some interest in that in the market generally, like some of the new developments are starting to offer that. So that's why I recommended that you be able to do this. I think it'll be rarely used. I don't think developers will do it as an economic, I don't think it will be a normal speculative development strategy for tear downs, because tear downs, the market is very clear for a homeowner, someone looking for a house of a certain size, but someone looking for two houses is, it's not as many people looking for two houses. So I'm skeptical it's going to happen very much, but Diane, you have a comment here?
I just wanted to shed a little light on how the tear down industry seems to work.
Please.
It's not that you've got somebody who's going in and saying, I'm buying this property and I'm going to go look for my contractor to build me this house. I mean, that does happen. But a lot of the builders that are doing this are actually buying the properties themselves. They tear down the house. They put it into an LLC. They tear down the house. They build a new big house with sediment control permit and dry wells and making their canopy payments. And they then sell the house. They market the house.
Yeah.
So to be clear, and I think that if in fact, if the thought is, could there be a cottage industry that springs up around this? No pun intended. The answer is probably, although realistically, if it has to be owner occupied and they come in the first instance wanting to build the new house with the accessory house, then I think that's going to be a challenge. I'm not sure how that
As
could be
well as the
permitted.
restriction on, and I know we're going to get to this, I think, next on the moving from the different types of licenses, the whole Airbnb thing, as well as the restrictions there, the owner occupied in that really limit the type of
Market.
thing that we're trying to avoid, I think, in this case, right?
I mean, the one thing I was thinking of was not the tear downs. I was really thinking about the planned communities like Kentlands, for example.
Cottages, right.
And, I know in the Potomac Yard development in Alexandria, they did allow for, they called them granny flats. I don't know honestly if they had kitchens, but you could have put a kitchen in above a number of the garages that were in this 100% new development. And that was a marketing thing for some of those units. Some of the folks wanted a granny flat. I don't know if they were going to use it as an ADU. I think they probably were more likely going to use it as a home office or something else. But I do think that in some of our developments that are honestly, brand new, there may be an interest in being allowed to add space that could be converted by the ultimate owner into an ADU, or it could be used by the ultimate owner as a home office.
I think sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
I was just saying, well, who is it hurting in the sense, like, who is prevented, just backing into the question from another, if you have the 5-year requirement or some year requirement, who's, I guess, the new homeowner that doesn't envision it right when they buy the home, that's who you're limiting in that case, right? But everyone else is going to be able to just do what they're normally going to do.
Or the person who wants to specifically build to suit in that way.
Right.
I know I want it, my mom and I are going to move in together
Sure.
to a new house.
Who's not the planned community developer, tear down person,
Right.
but.
What about the 40-year-old couple who is thinking long-term about 15 years from now, I may have mom and or dad, or in-laws move with us, and so wants to have that as an option. And let's say it happens quicker than they would have anticipated because there's some issue, and now you're saying they can't move. I mean, to me, I actually think the rebuild and having an ADU built is the most attractive, least costly way to do these. We will then have long-term, 30 years from now, a housing stock of attractive, well-built, built at the same time with the same type of construction, with the same type of architecture. I mean, I actually think we should be promoting that, and I think that owner occupied is is an absolute stickler for me, because that is fundamental to the accessory dwelling unit nature of this.
And with the other things we've done with the size, you know.
Yeah, and so I gotta be honest, the 5-year requirement makes no sense to me.
Another
I've never
council
understood,
compromise. That's what this was.
Yeah.
When we did it last time, there was some council members who,
When you
It
did
seems
it
to
the
me that the
first-
owner occupied is a solution in search of a
well,
problem.
we took it up last time.
I think the
It doesn't make
control
sense to me.
factor is the owner occupancy.
Exactly.
It will stop, that in and of itself will stop it from becoming just a builder marketing tool.
And we've talked about this a lot, about the folks who we want to be able to age in place, but there's also, we want to be allowing young families to be able to have their, adult, potentially senior parents to be able to live with them. And, I think the whole idea of this is to reduce barriers to housing and to have basically a penalty for being a new homeowner in Montgomery County makes no sense to me. So I would get rid of it as long as we are steadfast on the owner occupied, which is where we actually solve what I think is the problem, which I also think solves the speculative home builder issue. But I want the speculative home builder to be thinking about potentially putting an ADU. Sure. And because the other type of example of what you talked about isn't the speculative home builder who's buying a property, knocking down a house, rebuilding, and then selling it. They're buying a property, knocking down the house, and then finding a buyer, and then having that buyer custom build with the finishes that they want and the facade that they want, et cetera. And I want, in the part of the suite of options that they are suggesting is, hey, would you like to have an ADU? Do you have adult age parents that you think may want to live here? And even if they don't put the kitchen in, have it set up for the basement with the proper entrance, the cellar, the different options for an attached ADU, I think is exactly what I hope we are encouraging as part of this process.
And I would just say, I think we're thinking about, if you think about this, you're serving different needs and different populations, right? So that set, that's my set, right? We may move my in-laws are moving down in a year or two, and we're in that category of the squeeze generation. But then you're also thinking about this in an affordable housing tool. Maybe these are not the affordable housing things that happen, because they'd probably be maybe a little pricier, but that's okay, because you want a wide set of accessory needs in units that are dealing some of the interior basement that you need for the young person coming back to Montgomery County, or the family, And so I think having a variation, and with some of the safeguards we have, I think we're all saying this is okay.
Thank you.
To get rid of.
And I'll have to figure this out on how it works with your size limitation, because I won't have a principal house to be the lesser of. So I'll just have to, I'll just have to work that out.
Will, though, when it comes in for building permits. When it comes in for building permits, we'll look at the principal dwelling.
So you're okay with looking at the plan as the principal house?
Well, we'd have to, yeah.
Okay.
But I also think, there's a good chance that you're not going to see the application for the ADU. There's a chance you're going to see it because they're going to move in together with the other generation, or they're going to need it in order to pay for it. But there's a chance they're going to build the footprint for it and the permit to put the kitchen in and finish the job. It's like an unfinished basement.
So if
That it may be at a different point, and so that it will be clear of what's the principal dwelling and what's being requested as the ADU living space.
Not a problem, not a problem on the plans. If they're coming in for both, they'll have to have a building permit for each, but we definitely can manage that, and we do this kind of thing every day. So that's not a challenge for us in terms of the principal dwelling and the accessory dwelling unit. The ability to use that accessory dwelling unit, though, is not going to arise until there's an owner occupancy on one of those, so.
Okay, let's keep going here. We've got agreement from the committee. We got to take on a couple more big issues.
I think you've beaten the next horse to death on page 11, which is, should an accessory apartment in a structure built before 2012 be used as an ADU without regard to setbacks. We talked about the conditions under which a change to this existing structure would trigger setbacks, which is if it's added height or expanded out. So I think we beat it to death. And I think if you're satisfied with that a pre-existing garage or a pre-existing shed being used without regard to setbacks, so be it, with the exception of that it should be legally constructed. And we heard both Planning Department and DPS recommend that improvement.
Yeah, could I just ask a quick question? How about a new entrance or new windows? So we talked about like if you have a new floor or if you push it out a certain, that would be, that would trigger setbacks and other requirements. What happens if you have a structure that doesn't have any windows and it's a shed and you're using that as the footprint for your ADU and then you add windows or you add an entrance because there isn't
Are you asking if that triggers the
Yeah, does that trigger the setback? Because the one other issue that we've heard on the setback issue on small lots is privacy question. And so if there's a change to what could potentially be considered a privacy issue.
That will not trigger, they could put, if you've got an existing garage and you want to, I'm going to use this term, make it habitable, but if you want to make it into a livable ADU, you can put a window in there. You don't, you're changing the use, but you're not going to,
It's still a
You just have to
building.
meet the fire standards for exits and
well, you have to meet more than that. There,
but specifically related to windows and doors and exits.
windows,
Doesn't
there's
trigger
doors,
setbacks
there are
unless
many
you
other
are-
things that you have to do to make it a safe dwelling, but
Is it just the height that triggers the setbacks, or if you were to,
Height and any expansion out.
yeah,
Any
expanding it.
Expanding it.
any volume change?
So you could take that garage, put in the windows on the side, put in a door,
That's a
and
concern.
ignore the
Well, I mean, I
one
think
tweak.
the market will dictate, I mean, the person who lives on the property where the ADU, in the ADU is not gonna want a window that's probably looking into the neighbor, directly into the neighbors as much as just as much as probably the neighbor is not gonna want the window looking into them. I mean, I think that the market will solve a lot of this, but to alleviate any concerns, is there a way to not allow
A window.
an exit or, a door or a window that faces, if the setback requirement isn't met by an existing structure? I mean, if the setback requirement is already met, based on the existing code, then it is what it is. It's the same as what it would be in any type of
So.
renovation or expansion or.
So I would, well, first of all, there is a big difference between a window on a first floor versus a window on a second floor as it may relate to your neighbors. You can see a whole lot more from the second floor than you can from the first. But be that as it may, so you've got your garage. I mean, really, that falls into a development standard more than a building code issue, because if you don't want to have a window on an existing structure, you are writing, you're modifying a zoning text amendment right now, and if you want a development standard that would not allow for a window on a converted existing legally constructed garage, you can say that. And we will,
Yeah, I think it's hard because, again, today, if you have a garage and you want to turn it into a studio or a little home office, there are none of those constraints. You can put in doors, you can put in windows, you aren't expanding it, you aren't raising the ceiling height. You can turn it into a home office or a guest house without a kitchen. That is permissible today. And I think that it would be a bit onerous to say you can do that with any of these other kinds of uses, which could have a lot of activity in them. I mean, if you have, a guest house, you could have people staying with you frequently, but if it's an ADU, you somehow aren't allowed to have windows on the, lot line or something like that. That would be pretty onerous.
One thing you could do, you could say if the grandfathered structure is closer than like 10 feet, then you have to maybe do a special exception to, not to the lot line, but to the neighbor's house.
Right, that's what I mean.
If you have like, and I've seen an example of this, if you have, your house is here, the neighbor's house is here, and then you have a structure that's literally in between the two, and it's like, 7 or 8 feet from the neighbor's house, you know, we could establish that existing structures closer than 10 feet to the neighbor's house, not to their lot line, but to their
That's what-
house,
yeah.
would be either conditional use or, you know, something. You know, I'm
Or you could
sympathetic.
just require a fence, you know, or some sort of
answer's the
separation.
Answer is the fence, you gotta screen it with a,
Has to be screened with a fence. I mean, most people, I think, would almost do that
they do it anyway.
anyway. If I was,
That's, I mean, I think the market is going to resolve a lot of this, but I hear quite a bit, I mean, besides the parking, this question of, and Diane, you brought this up as well, the privacy issue, particularly in these older, smaller lots that do have quite a bit of an old structure that is there, and I mean, maybe the fence, requiring the fence resolves it. It does, I mean, fences are expensive. I mean, fences are actually way more expensive, I think, than most people think when they say, hey, just put up a fence. You know, it's tens of thousands of dollars to put in a fence. So I'm sensitive to that, but I don't know if there's any interest of colleagues here.
Well, I think, I'd like to look at a little more, and we're not gonna finish today, I think. I'd like to look a little more at the fencing, you know, how that could be a solution, and we'll see what that looks like. I think let's keep.
Yeah,
Back to that.
Come back to that. But in general, we're in agreement about existing structures.
Yes.
Yeah, with the, you know, if we can look into the privacy question.
We're flagging this one
If there are
issue.
ways to alleviate that.
All
mitigate
right.
it.
Let's keep going. We'll get as far as we can get by 12.
Okay, by 12. One of the interesting things, I'm on page 12, issue 12. Should setbacks be increased for buildings longer than 24 feet be changed for ADUs? The reason this came up sort of in testimony is you have pre-manufactured ADUs that are 32 foot long. And whether you want to require, and they're 10 feet high. Do you want to require a bigger setback for that because of the length of that structure? Right now, structures longer than 24 feet do require longer setbacks.
I think we should exempt, as you say, we may wish to exempt ADUs longer than 24 from the additional setback. That sounds fine to me. Any objection to that?
No, I think that's right.
Okay. It allows a particular type of prefabricated structure to,
You know, that's what they trailer in.
it's affordability, it's a trailer, yep, county executives talked about those, those prefab, container housing.
Right.
Always big on that.
Issue 13, a separate entrance, must it be on the side of the building? This was a point of contention when ADUs were first adopted by the county. It has continued to be this sort of design issue of whether it looks like a two-family house to neighbors, even though it may be. Right now, we have that prohibition to not be on the front of the house, so that it has to be from the side or the back.
Did the ZTA that I proposed change that?
Yes.
It said any side, because I think
Yes.
we were sort of looking at it almost as a duplex, and I think we're no longer looking at it as a,
So, yeah, go ahead.
Andrew.
Yeah, I'm a little sensitive to the duplex issue, and I think we should keep what the existing standard is. I think there's been a lot of uproar about these being duplexes. I don't believe that they are. I think we've made some considerable effort here to, you know, emphasize the accessory nature of the accessory dwelling units, and I think this is another example where I'm not sure it makes it any cheaper, I'm not sure it solves any problem, and it, you know, I think, I mean, in terms of changing the nature of the lot and what kind of housing is on it, I think this does it, and I would prefer.
One question, though, do
entrance
you mind if I interject? If it's a basement unit, that, I'm a little concerned if you had a pre-existing entrance for a basement that was in the front, that doesn't seem all that.
DC has those, but that's allowable, isn't it?
That's not
Go ahead.
It says before May of 2013.
If it's a pre-existing entrance before
So
2013.
as long as it's pre-existing, you could use that.
That's in the existing standard,
That's,
right?
yeah.
Or in this, if we were to say, no, sorry, you can't do it on the front, it has to be on the side or the back,
Yeah, you would keep the existing
it would just be
standard.
for new.
Keep the existing
Thanks.
Yeah, which is, I think, what
All
we're
right,
saying.
all right, so
Yeah,
just keep it existing standards,
yes, thanks.
okay?
Okay, on-site requirement, I think we all agree that we want to keep the on-site living requirement. This is, I thought we got great testimony from Brookville about how they have had accessory dwelling units in a very historic town for many years, and Mishbo said that the owner-occupied, sorry, on-site, the owner-occupied requirement is a really critical quality control.
I agree with all of that. The only problem is we have standards both in zoning and standards in the licensing agreement. And I would recommend you just keep the requirements in the licensing agreement and take it out of zoning. Doesn't change anything.
Okay.
It's just
We're on a lifelong
hygienic.
quest to move things out of the zoning code and into the legislative code, which is fine. I think, we've done this many, many times.
I don't want to set up a trap for somebody who doesn't know that there are two different places that this requirement exists, and then have two different standards that exist between licensing and zoning. So,
The intent here is to,
Not do belts and suspenders.
right, we agree that we want it to be owner-occupied, and we will have to have legislation in order to do that. That's fine.
no, it already,
It already exists, we don't have to do anything, right?
all you have to do is eliminate it from the
Need it from the
zoning,
Ordinance,
Ah, I see.
and it's still required.
and it's still required. DHEA is sitting here knowing that it's still required,
Is there any?
you know?
I see. So when you say,
You're okay?
that's fine.
Everybody okay?
Makes our job easier, so, sure, we're okay with that. It's-
You're saying it's already in there, so we don't have to put it in here
Correct.
again, that we've got the belts and this is
Correct.
suspenders, and we don't
Are
need
the
the suspenders
penalties
because our pants are up.
different, or the enforcement different, the mechanism? That's the only question I would have on it.
So from a zoning perspective, housing would probably do the same thing in terms of going for an abatement order. But we would go for an abatement order to enforce it.
I don't want to make, I think it's a critical component. We've talked about it, so I don't want to make it less likely to be enforced. But not that DHCA wouldn't do its best,
DHEA
but
has to speak for themselves. We currently do it. I think we are,
you're positioned to do it, and that's because it's in the zoning ordinance.
what's in the zoning ordinance, we enforce.
But if we take it
correct.
out of the zoning
Then-
ordinance.
But DHCA also has
Also has it in
enforcement
the
staff.
license.
They have enforcement staff as well, and we work together. So I don't know if it helps DHCA to have it in the zoning ordinance, to having us doing our piece of it while they're trying to do their.
Joanna's saying, put it in, I'm gonna second, as I don't know where.
Unless Tim tells me,
What's the risk?
It's enforceable one way or the other, so.
And if you'd like a confidential memo on the legal issue behind this, I'm happy to give
can we
that.
come back to it then? Because I'm.
I don't want to.
It's such a critical part of what we're hinging on here. I just want to make sure it actually is enforced and we're not straining anybody. You guys are used to doing it. Yeah. So maybe we can
We'll come back
to it.
I will give you some more background on this issue. There is some case law in this area.
I just think you're hearing, all three of us feel really strongly that this is one of the main critical tenets of this, and so we just want to make sure that it's happening. I think that's what we're.
Okay.
Yeah, what's that?
Can we pause?
Yeah, okay, so we'll come back on, I think it's April 4th,
Correct.
for what will certainly be the final committee meeting on this. We've
And
got
we'll
most of
go
the way
through the municipalities, which is a
Municipalities.
significant issue. I
Yep, it's a
think
big one.
Not at all simple.
Right.
And a lot of things that you may want to do as add-on bills. And we'll see. So-
Okay.
That's great.
So next meeting, April 4th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.